Hello! In today's cosplay tutorial video, we're going to be making the outfit for the Dimitrescu daughters from Resident Evil Village, and stay tuned to the end for a special reveal. For the dress, I'm going to be combining two patterns and then modifying them further. The base dress, I'm going to be using Simplicity 1045 and using View A, except I'll be using straight sleeves instead of these flowing sleeves and no cowl at the neckline. And for the hood, I'm using Simplicity 8866. This looks a lot like the dress, but unfortunately this pattern is just for stretch fabrics, and my fabric doesn't stretch. The fabric I'm using is this black fabric. It's kind of thin, but I really like the design of it. It has this kind of aged gold design to it, and I thought that would look really nice since I'm planning on doing a photo shoot for this costume in the dark. I sewed a quick mock-up out of some leftover scrap cotton, and then I sketched on the new neckline for the daughter, so it has this like gathered part over the chest, and then these little flaps that the brooch is attached to, and she's got her cape bit. So I sketched everything out, and now I'm going to cut apart the mock-up and use that to create my new patterns for this costume. Here's what everything looks like cut apart and ironed to be the new patterns. I am going to have to go and add seam allowance to some of these pieces since the lines were just where everything's going to be on the costume and not necessarily how much fabric is required for the entire thing. I cut the base dress pieces out of the black fabric and then serged them along the edges to keep them from fraying, but you could use a zigzag stitch or pinking shears, whatever method you prefer. I took the front panel of the dress and sewed on some boning casing to the back of it, leaving the bottom open so we can insert boning later. This will serve as a guideline for sewing the buttons on and will also, once the boning is added, help smooth out the front of the dress since this fabric is so thin. I took the two dress back pieces, sewed them together along the center back seam, and inserted a zipper. Sew all of the dress pieces together to create the base outer dress. For the flaps on either side of the bodice, I'm taking the pattern that I made earlier, cutting 4 of them out of the sparkle fabric and applying fusible interfacing to the back of each of them to make them a little bit stronger. Putting right sides together, sew the flaps along the curved edge, then trim off the excess seam allowance, turn it right side out, and we're going to add a bit of top stitching along that curved side. At the last minute, I decided to change the end of the hood to be curved rather than pointed, so I cut 2 out of the sparkle fabric and 2 out of some plain black cotton, which will serve as the lining. Putting right sides together, sew the corresponding hood pieces together along the curved edges. Putting right sides together, sew the hood to the hood lining along the opening. Then we're going to open up the hood and edge stitch the seam allowance to the lining side. And we're also going to sew the lining and the hood together along the bottom edge. I serged it just for ease, but you definitely don't have to do that. Sew the flaps and the hood to the neckline of the dress. I also added some more boning channels on either side of the dress. I had originally planned on making a lining for it, but then I was worried that that was going to make the dress too tight since it was already rather form-fitting, so I decided to just have the channels in the sides of the dress. It would have been a lot easier to do that earlier, but oh well. I traced around the neckline of the dress to get a pattern for a facing that I cut out of black cotton. Sew the facing to the bodice, then fold it inward and top stitch all around the neckline. For the pieces that cover the chest, I cut 2 of them out of some black cotton and applied some fusible interfacing to the back to make them a little bit more secure. Then I cut a piece of the black fabric and lined it up so that the area that's going to go across the chest matches, and I'm going to sew that section together. Flip it right side out and I'm just playing with the fabric and pleating it until it goes across the triangle in a pattern that I like. Then I trim away the excess fabric and serge or sew everything into place so that we have our little inset. To finish off the insert, I top stitched some black lace along the top. Position the pleated panels in place, and then we're going to sew them along the top stitching from earlier so there's no additional stitching, but it will keep them into place. I cut the sleeves out of the black fabric and had one end longer than the other so that I can gather it on one side to match the other side. Sew the sleeve together along the side seam, gathering the longer side so that they are even at the bottom, then hem along the opening. Gather the top of the sleeve slightly and sew them to the bodice. I sewed a snap to the back of the flap and the corresponding piece to the dress to help keep them in place. Insert boning into the channels and then sew the ends closed. Hand sew some black beads to the front of the dress over where the piece of boning is. I finished off the bottom edge of the dress with a rolled hem. And now we have a finished base dress. For the brooches on the dress, I'm using some resin brooches from the Dangerous Ladies. These were from their second sale, so there are some air bubbles and some imperfections on them, so I will need to do a little bit of cleanup work on them. You could also make your own out of foam or clay or warbler, or even just use some flower-shaped brooches from the craft store. I filled in some of the bubbles with spot putty and then sanded them. I sprayed the brooches with some primer to prepare them, then sprayed them with some silver spray paint, and to make them look a bit old, I went in with some brown acrylic paint and just kind of smudged it and wiped it away so they look a little bit rusty. And to keep that in place, I sprayed a coat of clear coat sealant on top of that. I wanted the brooches to be removable for washing the dress, so I glued on some pin backs onto each of them. Now we can use those pin backs to attach the brooch to the flap. For the optional cape on the back of the daughter's dresses, I took a long cut of black lace fabric, cut off the top end that had the scalloped edging on it, and then folded it in half, and we're going to sew it on either side, and these are going to be the bits that go down the shoulders. Cut a piece of black ribbon or bias tape that is long enough to go from the center of the brooch around the back of the hood and to the center of the second brooch. Sew the lace piece onto the ribbon, gathering the main big portion so that it is the right size. We're not really gathering the smaller parts that are going to go over the shoulders, just a little bit inward at each of the ends. Fold the remaining ribbon over to sandwich the lace in between the two sides and sew it down. Then I also sewed a skirt hook onto either end. Sew the opposite side of the hook onto the dress underneath the flap. And now we have a removable lace cape for the dress. For the choker style necklace, I cut some lace trim to be slightly smaller than the width of my neck, and I applied some fray check to the ends to decrease the fraying. Then I applied some ribbon clasps to really secure the ends. For the little dangly bits at the front of the choker, I marked the center placement and then cut a small length of black chain and made the little dangly bits out of 2 green beads and 1 gold bead on a gold eye pin, and then looped the top of the wire through the chain. Once all the little dangles were on, I used small jump rings to attach the chain to the lace. Then I used more small jump rings to add more lengths of chain to the necklace. So there's one that goes down 2 swags on the sides, and then one that crosses over all 3. For the pendant in the center, I'm using a pendant from Dangerous Ladies. This was purchased during their second sale, so it wasn't quite up to their standards, but I thought it still looked really good. I painted it silver, and then it came with a little blue stone, which I used a little bit of some yellowish green paint to give it a slightly more green cast to it, to make it look a bit closer to Daniela's stone, but you could use any gem with a silver rim around it. I then glued the pendant onto the lace. I used a jump ring to attach a clasp and some chain to the back of the necklace to make it adjustable. And with that, the first necklace is done. For the pendants on the necklace, I'm using some resin pendants from the Dangerous Ladies. These were from their second sale, so there are some imperfections in them, but since they're supposed to look super old, I'm not really worried about it. This little sword piece is missing the little loop at the top, but since it has an opening in the handle, I can just thread the chain of the necklace through it, and it shouldn't be an issue. You could make your own out of clay or warbler, whatever you prefer. I filled in some of the rougher areas with spot putty and then sanded it to make it smoother. I also sanded some of the rough bits on the other pieces, as well as taped off the gemstone to keep it from getting any paint on it. I coated the pendants with a layer of primer, then sprayed on some silver spray paint for the silver ones and gold spray paint for the kind of acorn-shaped pendant. For the weathering, I just went through with some brown acrylic paint and brushed it on and then wiped it off to give them a bit more of an aged look. And to keep everything all together, I coated it with a clear coat of sealant. The charms ended up being a little bit too narrow at the top for the chain that I had purchased for this costume, so I took a little tiny bit of the thinner chain from the choker and threaded the charms onto that, then connected it to the original chain on either side, and then at the end I just put in a lobster clasp using a jump ring to make it adjustable. For the final necklace that she wears, I just took some black glass beads and threaded them on to an elastic cord. And here's what all 3 necklaces look like together. For the daughter's sickle, I printed it out using the file from Dangerous Ladies, and it is split into 4 parts, and then there is a dowel, a 2-inch dowel connecting the top here, and then a 9-inch dowel that goes through all 3 of these pieces. So I need to glue it together so that everything will stay put. I glued the pieces together and then applied a coat of primer, which helped to highlight where some of the trouble issues were. I filled in the rough areas with some spot putty and then sanded it until it was a bit smoother. My sanding skills still need some work, but I think it looks a bit better. And here's what the sickle looks like with its final coat of paint. I sprayed some more primer on and then used a dark silver for the top and the bottom, and then some brown spray paint for the handle, and then coated everything with a clear coat to protect the paint. For the forehead tattoos, I'm using temporary tattoos from Aluna Creates on Etsy, and it comes with 2 forehead tattoos and also a little tester as well. And with that, the costume is done. A special thank you to Brittany Lee Artistry for putting together the reveal video, and thank you so much for watching. For more cosplay tutorial videos, please subscribe.